Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is going to be an evening all about confinement and urban inequalities. We have the honor to have Associate Professor Rashad Shabazz over from Arizona State University. He's the author of the book called Spatializing Blackness, Architectures of Confinement and Black Masculinity in Chicago. But we have decided also, because this is a public lecture and the connection with the city of Amsterdam, which is also there through our project, which has been funded by the municipality of Amsterdam's Center for Inequality and also the Center for Urban Studies. We're going to try to bring that conversation to Amsterdam, and especially the uncomfortable questions, try to bring them to Amsterdam in the panel conversation afterwards. Before I give the floor to Rashad, I just want to say a few words about that Amsterdam-based project. We just presented the final report, which is now in its polishing phase. It will be available online from next week on. We just presented it last Friday to a variety of what is called stakeholders in the criminal justice chain and the urban terrain. It was a really great meeting in Amsterdam West last Friday in Rupert with I think about 50 people who were all very interested in how do we move towards systemic change. So how do we relate as a city to the criminal justice system? How do we relate to as a criminal justice system to the inequalities that are produced within the urban terrain, and of course much broader than the urban terrain. And within that framework, of course, the issue of institutional racism is very important. But aside from that, also the ways in which other types of inequalities are exacerbated and reproduced. But we do feel within the project that we have to tackle the innocent colorblindness of Amsterdam's policies around criminal justice-involved young people. And that is why we had an academic conference today. So this is why some of the speakers that you're going to see, including all of us, might seem a little bit kind of tired because we've been meeting since 9 o'clock in the morning. We've had 3 very interesting panels, another keynote during the day, right around the corner here at the University Library, where we've been trying to really think through how do we deal with these issues as academics, but also as activist researchers. How do we tackle the issue of systemic change? How do we push for that? What kind of limitations does it kind of inherently bring with it? And at the same time, how can we really concretely connect it to abolitionist work or non-reformist reform work, as we were talking about as well, in the urban terrain. So that is kind of the preceding conversation that you are all going to be you're dropping into. I think about half of the room is presenters from that conference. So I really hope that over drinks and so after all this talk, you also have the chance to connect with each other. So all the people, half the people in this room, and I suppose that probably those of you who are here that that we don't know yet, that weren't at the colloquium, also have an interest in these topics. So do also use it as an opportunity to network with people who want to work around these issues. So I think I have nothing else to say. I just want to say thank you so much, Rashad, for accepting the invitation to come all the way over to Amsterdam to talk about your research and for sharing all of your insights with us here today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can y'all hear me? Yeah, y'all hear me all right? All right. Thank you so much, Juliet, as one of the primary organizers. I definitely want to thank the staff who helped to organize this today, and I want to thank all of my colleagues who were part of the wonderful conversation today, especially my favorite new colleague, Andrea, who I've been hanging out with for the last couple of days, who's a wonderful scholar at North Carolina State. So this is really dope. I'm looking forward to this. We're gonna have a really engaging intellectual exchange. We are gonna also have a little bit of fun. I know that's not something often attributed to my people, academics, but we will have a little bit of fun. We're going to learn a lot, and I'm really interested in sort of translating and narrating this story for this particular audience in this city. This is a city that I've been in. This is the 4th time I've been here. I really love Amsterdam, and it's a real privilege and a pleasure to be here at this institution before you all today. So without any further ado, let's get this thing going. So I'm going to talk about my research. I'm going to sort of try to talk about it broadly, and then I really want to narrow down on a couple of chapters in my book, and maybe if there's some if there's a little space, talk about how I've moved this research into the next phase of my my scholarly trajectory. Does that sound good?
Yep.
That's what's up. Okay, let's get it in. All right, so my name is Rashad Shabazz. I'm Associate Professor of Geography and African American Studies at Arizona State University. I got my PhD in this program called History of Consciousness. I'm a humanist, and I scour archives looking at the relationship between race and gender and cultural production and geography, particularly the built environment. And what I'm going to talk about today does that. And a lot of my research is really obsessed with a particular question. And that question is really about how do past histories, ontologies, cultural practices, discourses shape contemporary Black life? I'm really interested in how these things are working together. So all of my research projects, my first book, my second, and those to come, deal with time, and they deal with a relationship between the contemporary and the past. All historians know that history is not about the past, history is about today. So in many respects, though I will be engaging in the past today, I'm simply talking about the current moment, at least as it pertains to the United States, and during part of our talk, what this means in the Netherlands. So my first book, Spatializing Blackness, I'm writing a kind of geographic symphony, if you will, that has 4 movements. And the first one, the sonata, Spatializing Blackness, organizes the other 3 parts of the movement. The second one, like I said, I'll talk a little bit about, and maybe I'll get to the third and the fourth, but we're going to spend the majority of the time on the first. And Spatializing Blackness came out in 2015, grew out of my research, my dissertation research at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the book engages with the architectures of confinement and Black masculinity in Chicago from the early part of the 20th century to the dawn of the 21st century. And what the book does, and really what it really attempts to do, is it attempts to show how racial formation, gender performance were constituted within a particular geographic milieu, meaning that I see race and gender as not these sort of autonomous ideologies or historical or social formations, but that these are parts of human life that are deeply connected to place. We understand who we are as racial and gendered subjects, not through not just simply through history, not through ontology, not even just through cultural practices, but in and through space. And part of what I'm going to try to do is to demonstrate that today. And in doing this, also as someone who has a deep interest in prison abolition and trying to understand the ways in which prison shapes contemporary life, what I wanted to do was to think prison not through the period of 1973 to the present, which is in the United States. This is when mass incarceration starts. In 1973, it really emerged against the backdrop of Nixon's war on drugs. It morphed into a capricious war on drugs that functioned all throughout the 1980s and 90s through the Reagan, through the Reagan and Bush administrations, and metamorphosized through the Clinton era, and even continued on through Bush II and also through the Obama administration, right? I didn't want to focus on that because I wanted to know what were its precursors. I wanted to understand what were its spatial, political, racial, and gender precursors. We tend to talk about prison as if it emerged in January of 1973. And then somehow it becomes the soul-crushing institution that it has become. But I wanted to really interrogate this from a different perspective. So I began to look back about 100 years before mass incarceration took off. And what I'm going to share with you today reflects that. So I'm going to start with one of my favorite thinkers. I think maybe a lot of people in this room know this cat, French post-structuralist thinker, Michel Foucault. If you don't, you'll hear a lot about him, and you'll probably hear about him during the question and answer and the drinks period. So just get at me, and I'll say a little bit more about Foucault. So, as he writes, space is fundamental to any exercise of power, and what I was trying to do was to understand the geographic implications of the exercise of power. And I wanted to understand them in a couple of ways. I wanted to understand how they manifest themselves in terms of the geography of containment. I wanted to understand how power was exercising itself in terms of architecture. And I also wanted to understand how power was exercising itself in terms of the planning of cities like the South Side of Chicago during the early and middle part of the 20th century. So that's the book. Make sure you get a copy of it. It's really good. Okay, let's start. You know what? That would have been really good if I would have came here with some copies of it. It's not, but you know how to get a hold of it. Y'all are savvy young people. Y'all know how to get a book. Okay, let's go ahead and start. So just one more thing about the talk, and then I'm going to really get into it. So I'm very much a fan of I come out of hip hop culture, and I'm a deep fan of rap music. And like any good MC, she must be able to freestyle, just go right off the top of her head, and she's also got to have lyrics. So I'm going to read a little bit, and I'm going to freestyle, because I really believe in that art form really shaping what we as scholars be able to do. We got to be able to freestyle, just do it off the top of our head, and we got to read our stuff. So I'm going to read a little bit first. So, this talk is about how carceral power became a permanent fixture in Black Chicago. To tell this story requires explaining the obsession over Black-white sex and the multiple ways it was used to organize social and spatial, henceforth socio-spatial life during the early part of the 20th century. Carceral power in the form of policing entered the Black Belt, which is this area here that I'm going to talk about, entered the Black Belt in Chicago vis-a-vis attempts to control interracial sex and socializing in the Black-white sex districts in the Black Belt. And in doing so, it became a permanent fixture. Policing the Black Belt did more than install state power in the Black community. Policing was also a mechanism to access and consolidate whiteness, organize the racial geography of the city, regulate Black men's sexuality and that of the poor. Policing, however, was not simply about white repression of Black people. Blacks used police power to obviate claims of Black pathology and place limits on poor Blacks. I demonstrate this by interrogating the role racial and sexual politics played in Southside vice districts, and I contend that policing was a dynamic exercise of power that profoundly shaped the geography of the Black Belt and the social lives of white Chicagoans. Okay, so this is the, right. Okay, this is the South Side La Vie. So in the latter part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, Chicago had a very famous vice district, similar to the one that's just a few blocks from here. And in that vice district, there was sex work, there was gambling, there was drinking. Dignitaries, wealthy people, statesmen would come to Chicago in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they would have their weekends in the city, similar to the way in which, British white men invade the city here during the summertime. And they would spend their money, they would enjoy the sort of sexual and transgressive delights of the levee. And it was a well-known place. But by the early part of the 20th century, the racial politics of both the levee and the community around the levee began to change. So if anybody knows anything about downtown Chicago, this is Clark Street, one of the major thoroughfares. There's 18th and there's 22nd. So this is like the heart of downtown Chicago in the early part of the 20th century. Just on the outskirts of this was a poor and working class, mostly white community that had been living there for decades. But all that began to change right after about 1910, 1912. And what happened during that period was that Black Americans fleeing terrorism and white supremacy in the South left the South en masse to escape Jim Crow. I'll talk more about Jim Crow in a few. Actually, I'm going to keep it here. They began to escape Jim Crow, and it is that migration in the United States, which has come to be known as the Great Black Migration, is the largest migration of human beings in the internal United States in its history. Between about 1910 and 1970, somewhere around 2.5 million Black people fled the South. And they fled the South in large part because of the politics of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a geographic, economic, and terrorist form of public policy that shaped the former slave states, from Florida all the way up to Virginia, all the way over to Texas. And between the years of about 1887, during the height of this period called Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a period in which the South was being put back together by Northern soldiers and Northern policymakers after the Civil War. The South was decimated by the Civil War. Towns were destroyed. In many respects, it was akin to what many cities looked like in Europe after the end of the Nazi regime in the Second World War. And so Northern soldiers and Northern policymakers were trying to reconstruct the South. And they were doing things like building roads, creating public works, creating public water, schools, hospitals, bridges. But at around 1887, Reconstruction ended. And the end of Reconstruction set off a wave of terror that ran through the entire southern United States. And at the center of that reign of terror was something called lynching. I'm not going to show any images of lynching because they are horrific, and there's no need to traumatize anyone tonight, especially myself. But lynchings were forms of public racial terror where families, and it's important that I restate this, where families would bring their small white children and their grandmothers and their grandfathers and watch Black men and women be burned, shot, desexed, mutilated, gutted, and tortured in public performances of white supremacy. They ran all throughout the South. There were hundreds of them. They became so popular that they were put on postcards and advertised in newspapers all over the South. So this, against the backdrop of economic terror, the denial of the ability to vote, pushed Black people into flight mode, and the push of white terrorism in the South and the pull of the chances of democracy and inclusion in the North set off the Great Black Migration. And when Black people showed up in cities like Chicago, they felt that they had reached a certain level of freedom and mobility, but in many ways they were caught up in a new kind of politics of Jim Crow, but in a very different landscape. And in that landscape, in the early part of the 20th century, it was the police who did what average white citizens did in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Florida. And in Chicago, one of those policemen was a German man by the name of Max Nootbaar. And as was the case in the South, Max Nootbaar was deeply concerned about the presence of Black people in the city. And the presence of Black people in the city was largely being mediated and negotiated through the relationship of Black people in general and Black men in particular to white women. So in one of these clubs in the Levee, just go back to that map really quickly. Does it go back? There we go. In a club in the Levee, which is, actually it's around 21st Street, there was a raid because as Black people began to move up to the city, Black men and Black women began to hang out in these clubs downtown. And Max Nootbaar could not have Black men hanging out in clubs where white female sex workers were at. So what Max Nootbaar does is he raids the club. Not because Black men were doing anything illegal, not because there was actually anything illegal happening in the club. Alcohol was legal, sex work was normalized, but what Max Nootbaar could not have was Black men having any kind of sexual contact with white women. So I won't read the quote because you all can read it. But you know, as he says, when young white women are hanging with Black men, you know, I have to get involved. And in Chicago, when we talk about the emergence of carceral power, which my colleagues and I have been talking about today, which is essentially about the way in which the techniques, the technologies, and the practices that make prison possible, policing, containment, surveillance, right? The way in which they exist in prisons all over the world. The extent to which those practices began to manifest themselves on the everyday quotidian geographies of Black people in Chicago manifest itself through anxieties around Black men and white women interacting in a social space. So it really became about the deployment of carceral power in the form of policing in Chicago emerged against this anxiety. And that's the only picture I could find of Max Nootbaar, who was born in Germany in the 1840s. He immigrated to the United States sometime in around the 1870s, and he became a police captain and worked in the Chicago Police Department until his death in around 1920 or so. So the question I had to ask myself is this: how does this German-born man come to understand and develop an anxiety, a political and physical anxiety around Black men and white women interacting? How does he come to understand this? You know, what are the mechanisms and tools and techniques? What are the histories and discourses that began to shape Max Nootbaar's notion to deploy his power as a police officer toward this phenomenon? Well, part of it has to do with the fact that as black people left the South en masse, the discourse around the problems of black people in public space followed. And those problems, those discourses had to do with the fact that black people were seen as inherently criminal, that black sexuality was rapacious and uncontrolled, and black men were effectively rapists. This discourse found its most profound articulation in a film that was written, it was directed by W.E.B. Griffin? Yeah. W.D. Griffin, thank you. I'm thinking W.E.B. Du Bois. That is not a confusion I should ever have. W.D. Griffin, which was based on a novel called The Klansman. And in this novel and in the film, Reconstruction is seen as a profound problem. It is seen as a backward lurch in the South's history. And black people are running amok. They are destroying the culture and the politics and the infrastructure of the South. And it is only through, they're destroying the politics, the culture of the South, and they are rapists. Black men are rapists, and white women are damsels in distress in need of white men to save them. And the white men who save them are hooded sheet terrorists known as the Ku Klux Klan. In the novel and the film, they are the heroes of the South. They rid the South of the awful, dangerous black men. They undermine the possibilities of Reconstruction, and they effectively create a form of sanction and public terror to keep black people and black men in check. They effectively transform the racial landscape of the South to keep these uncontrolled people in check. And the anxiety, again, is largely constituted around interactions between black men and white women. And all throughout the South, during this period of, between the end of the Civil War, really up until the early 20th century, is this profound anxiety. At the end of the Civil War, this postcard of the miscegenation ball. Miscegenation means effectively interracial sex or producing mixed race offspring, right? We see it in placards. We see it in postcards, right? Miscegenation or the millennium of abolition. We see scholars, Southern scholars, writing about the profound problems of black people having mobility. Black people having mobility. And, you know, one thing I have to mention here is that it is not a coincidence that these discourses emerge after 1864. Before 1864, black people in the South exist in bondage. They are human cargo. They are enslaved subjects. They do not have mobility. They cannot go where they want. They do not have sexual autonomy. They cannot vote. They are simply immobile subjects who are incarcerated, imprisoned on Southern plantations. The end of 1864, where the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment come in, and the 13th Amendment abolishes plantation servitude in one's backyard, while also creating a loophole that we can talk about later. And black people have physical mobility, sexual mobility, and the right to vote. This discourse emerges. And the white South is trying to figure out, what must we do to protect white women and keep black people in check? And this in check is not a political check. It's not simply a political check. It is a physical check. And part of this is this sort of anxiety of black men being rapacious, white women being damsels in distress, and a geography of containment must be created to ensure that the two do not coexist, that they simply do not occupy the same space. But even if, as it moves out of the 19th century, oh, yes, just one other thing here. The geography of anti-miscegenation laws, right? And as you can see, and sorry about that, let me see, I'll just, you can see here is the former slaves, this is the former slave territories. You can see that the South are the first to create anti-miscegenation laws. They do it almost immediately, which means that blacks and whites cannot marry. And in many cases, they cannot publicly demonstrate any kind of affection toward each other. In short, they simply just cannot rub up against or be near one another. But as we move out in the 19th century and we move into the 20th century, these laws, this anti-miscegenation discourse, this discourse of the hell of Reconstruction, the need to create protections for white women, and the need to control blackness manifest themselves in the Jim Crow laws and the signifying effects of white supremacy. And these signifying effects are white only and colored signs all over the public South. Black people can't go here, or black people must enter through here, black people must sit here, white people must sit here. Part of this, of course, is about trying to publicly demonstrate forms of white supremacy through signs, right? And making black people go into back doors or sit in the balcony as a sign of their racial inferiority and subsequently the supremacy of whiteness. But it is also a way to create a kind of public check on what bodies are rubbing up against each other, who is sitting next to who, particularly as it comes to places like water fountains, public pools, and buses. And this is also deeply invested in this anxiety about discourses about black people, their criminality, their sexuality, and their sort of uncontrolled nature. All right, and I'm sure people have seen these kinds of images before, right? And again, I'm making the claim that this isn't just about superiority, but it's also a kind of sexual geography that Jim Crow is attempting to mediate, to organize, and to essentially place a kind of tourniquet on who can and who cannot interact with one another. So as black people are leaving the South, you have a set of academics, white academics, who began to write about the problems of black people in urban space. And they began to issue a number of warnings. And one of them is Frederick L. Hoffman, a social scientist. I just have to say for the record, and no shade, a lot of them tend to be social scientists. And we could talk about why that's the case and what that means, but a whole lot of them are social scientists. Frederick Hoffman, who's a social scientist, and he begins to write about what he says is an impending doom that is coming to northern cities. He says Philadelphia and New York and Newark, New Jersey and Chicago and Detroit and St. Louis and all of these cities are about to confront a profound danger. And that danger is that the rapacious, criminally inherent, and uncontrolled Negro is going to descend upon the cities. And as they descend upon the cities, northern cities have to take explicit steps to manage black people. And he talks about what happens in the South. He talks about lynching. He talks about segregation. He talks about Jim Crow as ways to manage black people's mobility. And he is arguing from a kind of social scientific perspective that the North has to do something, right? So, as all of these newspapers are writing about and news reports are coming up about the great black migration that is happening, right? Hoffman writes this in 1896, sorry. Hoffman writes this about 1896, and within a few years, the great black migration is on, and the numbers are swelling of people who are leaving the South. And that's an image of Mr. Hoffman. So here is the geography, here's the sort of the geography of black migration, right? What's my time? How am I looking on time?
You are about almost 30 minutes in.
All right, so I got about like, what, 5 minutes?
Yes.
That's what's up. I got it. Don't even sweat it. I got it. All right, so look, so here's how it works. Black migration was mediated and produced through 19th century train lines that took the products of enslavement north, which means that, so for example, I'm from Chicago. You know, this is me right here. My people are from Alabama. My people came up from Alabama during the last leg of the Great Black Migration. Everybody in here knows who Jay-Z is, right? I could say Jay-Z and everybody like, yeah, I know who Jay-Z is, right? Yeah. Can I see some head nods, please? Okay, thank you. All right, so Jay-Z's people are from South Carolina. You know, and of course, right, he ends up in New York. The leader of the Black Panther Party, the late Huey P. Newton, who was named after the governor of Louisiana, Huey P. Long. His people were from Louisiana, and Huey ended up in Oakland, right? And that's really how it is. So black people who are in the North, their grandparents and great-grandparents who came from the former enslaved states followed the same trade routes. That's how we ended up where we were. So what's happening is that from about 1910, 1912, all the way up to the early 1970s, these are the train lines that are moving black people from south to north. And again, it's the largest internal migration of black people in the nation's history. And in Chicago, many of us constituted ourselves in this area called the Black Belt. So the Levee is right up here, near the water. Here is the Black Belt. And the Black Belt was created largely through housing practices. In the United States, before 1930, to buy a home meant that you had to have 50% of the housing price up front, and that you had to pay the remaining balance off within 3, 4, 5 years. In 1938, the United States creates a system around housing. And what that system did was it allowed for 3% of the housing cost to be put down and for the other 97% to be financed. And it was financed through these two federal agencies called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac developed a system by which it would guarantee loans in certain places. Those loans were inscribed in race. And what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac essentially said was, you give no loans here. None. You can give loans here, all white areas. You can give loans here, white areas. And you can give loans here, white areas. But we will not guarantee loans here. And what that did is it racialized housing in the United States for nearly a century, and it created the racial segregation that exists in the country today. It also created an uneven development of wealth, where white people in the United States got welfare. I'm gonna say it again. White people in the United States got welfare. they got a federally backed program that allowed for them to access banking and finance and to spend 3%, put 3% down on a home, and have the other 97% finance, and to build wealth in these racially segregated areas. And black people were kept out. White Americans got 98% of the funding. That skew helped to create the uneven distribution of wealth across the across the color line that exists today. And this is how it was done. It was not bootstraps. It was public policy that provided a welfare program that unevenly distributed wealth across the color line. So here we are, 1934. So because black people were denied access to housing, the federal government steps in right after the Second World War, and they say, we hear you black people. We know that you are suffering living in these awful tenements. We know that you have been locked out of housing opportunity. We know that you face forms of discrimination. And what we are going to do is we are going to create a new form of public housing for you that we are going to put in black communities all over the United States only. We're not going to put it in white communities. We are not going to put it in white communities, but we are going to put it in black communities all over the United States. And the whole goal of this housing is to allow for black people to save the 3% down payment so that they enter the housing market. That's really the major goal of it. And also to get black people out of these awful tenements that they had been living in Philadelphia, in New York, in Boston, in Chicago, and in Los Angeles. And in Chicago, they created one of the biggest. It was called the Robert Taylor Housing Projects. And for a period, it was one of the biggest in the world. And for a short period of time, it was beautiful. Full of kids, spacious, affordable. But by the mid-1960s, when the post-industrial economy wears off and labor unions lose their power through offshoring industrial labor production, these working class, lower middle class homes, so communities, descend into chaos. And as the United States economy catches a cold, black communities like Robert Taylor get cancer. And that disproportionality creates profound instability, and crime rates spike profoundly. The spike in crime rates resuscitates something that scholars began to write about in the early part of the 20th century when they say these people are criminal. They must be controlled. They have to be dealt with. And what happens is that the carceral power that entered into Black Chicago in the early part of the 20th century to control white Chicagoans' anxieties about the possibilities of interracial sex between black men and white women metamorphosizes itself into this highly technological, deeply pernicious, violent form. And housing projects like Robert Taylor that are experiencing instability become imprisoned. And what that means is that all of the techniques and tactics that make prison possible, containment, architectures of containment, surveillance, policing, those things get mapped onto the everyday space that these poor and working class black people are living in. And the city effectively contains the instability. Instead of job programs, instead of access to the housing market, instead of education, instead of anything that would sustain black people's life and make life for these folks better, what the Chicago Public Housing Authority, which is a federal agency, and the City of Chicago Police do is they create a prison outside of the normally sanctioned prisons. And they do things like they put bars over the entire housing project. They put bulletproof glass in the lobby. They put turnstiles in the hallways as people move in and out. They also create an identification system and make residents wear badges as they move through. There's an on-site court, and I kid you not, a damn jail in the housing project. And this form of carceral power and techniques that creeps itself into black communities really over a kind of 40-year period and reaches its kind of apex by the 1970s provides the easy runway to move people from this place in 1971 into the form of mass incarceration that begins to take off in downstate prisons 2 years later. The city begins to construct its prison population. The city was effectively birthing it over decades. And as we sit and chat more about how that happens and the implications of it, I'll do my best to try to give you a clearer picture if this wasn't one, and also to talk about the implications of what that has to do for other cities in the United States, as well as for places like one of my favorite cities, which is this one right here in the Netherlands. Thank you, I appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you, Rashad. That gives so much food for thought. I'm directly like mobilities and immobilities, and I can see all kinds of historical lines here. But before we dive into, yes, please take a seat. No longer needed to stand up. Before we go into the panel discussion, I would like to see if there are any questions specifically for Rashad, specifically about this context, before we bring it to Amsterdam. Any questions? Yes. Did you raise? Oh, you? Yes, sorry.
Thank you, that was super interesting. I was wondering about the brief moment where you described the state as almost having good intentions, like building these beautiful public housing projects and saying, well, you can live here and then you can just put down the 3%, surrounded by much more nefarious state approaches to this. So what happened there just after the war?
Yeah, so these housing projects were built in the 50s, like right after the war. I think this one, they started constructing this one in like 1952, and by 56 or 57 it was completed. The post-war economy bottomed out, so that kind of consumer economy of building roads and highways and making cars, mass consumption, making housing available for, white middle class, that bottomed out by the middle part of the 1960s. And there was a retrenchment in the ability of unions to kind of hold off offshoring. And I would say part of the reason that unions lost ground is because they were racist toward black people and didn't want to provide women access. There's a consequence, you know what I'm saying? But that, by losing ground and offshoring, those people who lost their jobs, those sort of, working class and middle class white Americans who lost their jobs, they had to restructure, and they found ways to restructure. But for black people, it meant that they had simply lost everything. And these communities that were meant to sort of create a pathway for black people into middle class, they turned into this. And this is across the board. This is just one case study. This happens in New York, it happens in Philly, it happens in Oakland, it happens in Los Angeles and Seattle. It really happens all over. And carceral power is the way that the state controls the instability that begins to happen in these places. Activism, civil rights movement is what is pushing the United States federal government to create this housing. So yes, it's civil rights movement. Thank you for that.
Are there any more questions specifically about this talk? We will be connected. Yes.
Just a quick clarification. You refer several times to 1973 as start of mass incarceration.
Yes.
Could you provide a definition?
Yes. Yes. So mass incarceration is the United States public policy pivot toward using prisons, policing, parole as a way to grapple with what are essentially social issues of joblessness, of economic instability, of drug addiction. You know, people are coming back from the Vietnam War, and there are lots of men who have deep drug addiction issues. Also, deindustrialization is ramping up, right? And so there's not the same kind of economic stability. Plus, there are feminist activists, there's Black power, there's a student movement, and so there's this kind of political instability in the country. And what Nixon does is he takes these resources of police, of probation, the court system, and prisons, and moves it in the direction of this instability and says, this is how we're going to deal with this. And what happens is that the national prison population at like 1972 was like 80,000. By the time Reagan is in office, it's over 1 million. And by the time Clinton is in office, it's 2 million, you know? So that's what we mean by mass incarceration, that there's a direct public policy incentive to deal with political, economic, and social instability through using the criminal justice system. Good question.
Thank you. Yes, one final question. Go ahead. Yes.
It's sort of maybe a little bit of a random remark as a rap fan. Do you know this album, Brick Body Kids Still Daydream?
Say it again.
Brick Body Kids Still Daydream. It's by Open Mike Eagle.
No.
It's a rapper who lived there, and it's a concept album about this.
Really? Oh, I got to get on that. Seriously, I got to get on. We got to talk after this because I got to get on that.
It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you for that.
It's a guy who grew up there.
Yeah, I got to get on that. Thank you. Thank you.
We exchange Spotify playlists.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
I want to invite to the stage Femke Kouwlingfrijks. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You are a lecturer in youth and society, but you are also newly appointed.
Yeah, I'm a professor by special appointment, as they say, studying urban issues in Amsterdam.
Yes, so she is the new Wieboud chair. So Femke, please join us on stage. I'd also like to invite Andrea Leverens on stage, who provided the keynote during the day and is the author of So I'm going to give you this microphone, actually, because you're the one that doesn't have a mic. And so Andrea is the author of the book Intersecting Lives, How Place Shapes Reentry, and is professor of sociology at North Carolina State University. Recently, since 3 months, she used to be in Boston, so there's also those connections. So somehow you guys are from the Midwest or North and now moving south again.
We were a few hundred miles away from each other, actually.
Yeah, so interesting connections there. I'm going to try to segue us into I'm going to try to moderate this panel talk by providing perhaps some links. So one thing that really comes out of your talk, Rashad, is how carceral violence is apparently built on anti-Black violence, on racism, on slavery, and trying to connect that to the Dutch context a little bit, I would say probably colonialism. So how
we tend to understand carcerality in the Netherlands very much separate from, very much as a benign way of dealing with people who have problems, of taking care of them, giving them the attention that they need. We tend to pride ourselves on having very low incarceration rates, but somehow our prison population is largely, and this is in the opposite direction of our society, prisoners with what we call migrant background, which is already problematic in and of itself, constitute about 67% of the current prison population. And then those who are marked Dutch means that they and their parents, both of their parents, were born in the Netherlands. So that's also colorless, right? So it can be people who are actually people of color but considered Dutch. So it's nationality-based, which is really weird. Anyway, it makes a lot of things very opaque. But through this focus that you had on this great displacement, it suddenly made me think of the way in which let's say, historical mobilities and immobilizing practices impact on the way in which carcerality is currently constituted, and trying to bring that to the Netherlands, thinking particularly of the way in which carcerality operates in Amsterdam by hiding itself, but then popping up through the policing of particularly migrant-dominant, quote-unquote migrant, right? Colorful neighborhoods or vulnerable neighborhoods, they have all kinds of names, and is predicated on the immobilization of people of color and confining them to particular neighborhoods. So a person who is a person of color who is outside of that neighborhood becomes someone to be watched, someone out of place, right? So this aspect of your talk really resonated with me, and I just wanted to kind of see if that was something that Femke also, in your longer history, so I'm new to researching Amsterdam, you've been researching Amsterdam much longer, if that's something that you recognize. And then particularly its interconnection with masculinity, in the sense of masculinities of color, and in the sense of this notion of the masculine body of color being also sexually dominant or dangerous. So this construction of dangerousness also around sexuality. I'm just going to ask that to Femke before we segue back to...
Yeah, so much to unpack here. I was thinking when I listened to your talk that there is somehow two intertwined, seemingly opposite movements happening here in the Netherlands, I think, historically also. One is very similar to what you explained, and the other one is, so you explained like the mass incarceration sort of became the answer to many social issues, which originated in this very strong historical tradition of segregation and the related violence. This is similarly also happening here with the policies of containment of predominantly communities of color in certain neighborhoods and the very oppressive forms of control. But at the same time, there is also this rationale of containment sort of invading the social domain. So for example, black men are both seen as perpetrators and victims in a way. So this containment becomes a sort of form of care in the social domain. So I give you an example, which has to do with this idea of geographies of sexuality also. So we have this movement here in the city now of smoothification, as René Boer, a fellow geographer, calls it. So cleaning up basically the inner city. And our mayor wants the sex workers to move out of the city center because, well, everybody's fed up with the white guys from England, you know, invading the center. Yeah. So she has this idea of an erotic center, which is a sort of like a cluster of sex workers in one big building somewhere far away from the center. So this erotic center should be placed somewhere on the outskirts of the city. she tried to place it in the southeast at first, which has the largest black community in Amsterdam. Massive protests happened. Now she's in doubt between placing it in the north or the south of the city. And there is this, so it's a classic movement of pushing the sort of controversial dynamics out of the center. But the rationale which is used is not only this idea of classic law and order and people seeing them as perpetrators, but also victimizing black men. So on both sides of the spectrum. So I actually heard the mayor say very recently in a meeting, I want the city center to be a safe and nice place for young men of color to go out again. Saying, I want the sex workers should be out of the picture so they can have neat, decent ways of spending their time in the city center. At the same time, communities on the outskirts are saying the same thing, basically. They're saying, we don't want this erotic center in our neighborhood because we want to protect our young men of color from the danger of having this erotic center around the corner. So there's this weird entanglement of black sexuality, specifically black male sexuality, as both a danger and as at the same time wanting to protect these black young men from becoming the victims. So we have to, it's a very paternalistic rationale that I think it's very typically Dutch. So we have this, we have this tradition also. It's only since a couple of years that we're actually openly talking about institutional racism. Before we had this fantasy that all the bad stuff of coloniality just happened somewhere far away overseas and we're all happy, colorly, blind, progressive people. And we're slowly changing this idea. So for a long time it was all this like, sort of discomforts of living in a mixed race society. We have to smooth them over with this very strong paternalistic idea of decency, policies of decency. So there's this, I don't know, Wakan wrote about it nicely. There's this sort of marriage between top-down, oppressive control mechanisms with very internalized mechanisms of disciplining that are sort of packaged in this idea of being neat, and we have to protect these poor people from falling into danger. Yeah,
just
sorry. Sorry, no, I don't mean to interrupt. You don't have to stay with the microphone. It just made me think, very recently there was a presentation back at the UEA by a colleague, Julian Isenia, and he was discussing that a lot of these sexual policies were implemented through public policy. So a lot of this kind of thinking about the quote-unquote deviance of migrant families, particularly black migrant families, but also Arab migrant families, being too numerous or being too small or strangely related, so not compliant with the nuclear family model, the white middle-class nuclear family model. So all of these social policies try to skew people toward, please comply with this particular family model. And that is the decent family, that is a good family, that is a family that won't get into trouble.
And it's a white middle-class family also. So there's this...
It's modeled on the white middle-class family, but it's selling it as if it were a colorblind thing. Like this is simply the good thing. The good thing is the right way. And that very much intertwined the policing of sexuality in the, especially in the southeast, in Bijlmer, by reinforcing also issues like you get kinderbijstand, the amount of money you get in social welfare per child, all of these kinds of ways through which public policy tries to shape how people engage in their intimate life. So this very
trying to reach behind the door, and at the same time having the highest outplacement ratio in Northern Europe, so taking children away from their parents because the parents are not capable of parenting well. So the institutionalization of children of color, and that being a constant worry on maybe...
Yeah, sometimes I feel like we don't have this mass incarceration industry in the Netherlands, but we do have a mass youth care industry in the Netherlands that is very much a containment policy. That it's very, yeah, it has this controlling purpose, and it's also about geographies of containment, but packaged in this social policy. I think that's, yeah, it's a similar dynamics, but it has a different history, of course.
Yeah. Does anything similar exist, like in relation to trying to reach behind the door? So they're talking a lot about policing public space, so interracial relations, but in the public, how does that reach behind the door in Chicago?
I see several continuities. One is that there's what mobilized what happened in Chicago was anxiety. It was really about an anxiety that stretched back decades before, and there was this belief of, this is what normative sexual relationships look like. They're intra-racial, they're straight first, they're intra-racial, and so what we as the policymakers in the city have to do is to ensure that we maintain this normative dynamic. And what that means is that we have to destroy the levee, and we have to ensure that Black men and Black women stay in a place that facilitates them being sexually involved with each other, and white people do the same. And the city was actively involved in creating this, and the police played a role, because in the United States, the only agency that polices boundaries of any kind are the police. We don't really have any other, border agents, which are part of policing. They do all of this work. And so whether we're talking about the latter part of the 19th century in Georgia, or we're talking about, 1950 in Chicago, it's the police who do it. And the through line, it's not, I know people want to say it's hatred. Yes, it's anti-Blackness, but it's also a profound anxiety, and that interracial sex produces anxiety, and that anxiety has to be responded to through public policy, or at least for a period, terrorism. But in the North, it was largely through public policy, and the police play the role of maintaining the borders. And then then urban planners got involved, and other people. But so in terms of what's happening here, in terms of the red light district, there's this anxiety about, how do we maintain and keep control and ensure that, normative sexual behavior is happening? How do we ensure that, that men of color are behaving in a way that is normative and amenable to our standards? And removing and borders and sanctioning and organizing the public geography is just one of the ways that I think many societies in the West, because those are the ones I know the most, have done this. There's examples of this in France. There's examples of this in Mexico City as well. And this, Chicago is just, I think, one of many stories that definitely has continuity between right now and the Netherlands.
I'm going to try to make a segue into Andrea's work, but through the border, because I think that's something very interesting that is coming up multiple times. And I think that in order to understand the current carceral situation in the Netherlands, it's imperative to talk about the carceral and not just the criminal justice system, because if we only talk about the criminal justice system, we forget this other system we have that excludes en masse bodies of color, which is the asylum system, which actually de-urbanizes and is purposely purposely directed at not yet involving people in the city, which is geographically something very interesting to talk about. But it has to do also with these policies of mobility, right? That who can come to white Europe? Who can come to, who can be in the city? What kind of bodies get to be in the city? And in the period of, well, we can't exactly call it decolonization, but let's say after the Netherlands, and its very complicated relationship with independence and decolonization, it started to instate also rules on the mobility of people from former colonies to come here, right? And so there's all of these rules around controlling the mobility of bodies of color, which I think the prison system definitely does in its current expression, and probably also in its past expressions. But the other carceral system we have, which is the policing of migrant mobilities, I think does that in a much more obvious way. And somehow these talks are often not held together, especially when they're about the urban, because then the border is kind of seen as, well, that's not, the border isn't like next door, right? So it becomes more complicated. So I'm just thinking about this embeddedness, so through borders, thinking about this embeddedness in the city, and this very neighborhood-based, you're talking about the levee. In your book, Andrea, you speak about different ways in which people who are coming out of the criminal justice system re-enter the neighborhood, and the different types of relations they have with those neighborhoods, with those spaces, and that there's also populations that tend to float from space to space. And you were saying in your keynote that that was mostly the most vulnerable people tend to be the people that move or are moved around the most. So I was wondering how that relates, how that particular vulnerability to then excessive mobility might relate with racial or gender or class dynamics, or if that was something that didn't really correlate in your talk.
Well, so I think the interesting thing there is, I think that it can, with race and ethnicity being one dimension of marginalization, the people that I met and that I interviewed who were the most marginalized were people who had longer histories of drug use and alcohol use. That did not map on to, well, it did map onto race. The white people that I interviewed were, with one exception, all had a history, all had a very extensive history of drug and alcohol use. The one exception was someone who was arrested and incarcerated on driving under the influence charges, but did not think he had a problem with alcohol use. So he did not, everyone else self-identified as having a long history of drug and alcohol use, and often had related charges, either directly, like drug possession or DUI, or indirectly, like shoplifting. That was probably me. Shoplifting.
I turned that one off.
Okay. Do I have to do something here, or is it okay? So indirectly of like shoplifting to support drug use, and the people of color, some of them had a history of drug use, some of them did not. And I think that the reason for those patterns is it basically takes more for white people to get arrested and incarcerated, so they have more disordered lives before they end up in prison or jail in the first place. Whereas some of the young black men, for example, they basically exist in the world, and that makes them a target of law enforcement. And so some of them they didn't have the same sorts of disadvantages in terms of drug and alcohol use, which impacted their behavior, their way of coping, their relationships with other people that contributed to that marginalization. So in some ways, it was sort of a complicated, multifaceted ways of being marginalized. The people of color were definitely marginalized along, because of racism, but some of them had strained relationships with families because of histories of incarceration, but not because of histories of addiction, right? And so they were, I think maybe more likely to be able to stay in family homes, to be able to rely on family resources. That gave them that included people who were couch surfing on, family members' sofas and things like that. So it's not like they didn't all have very stable lives, but they had more of a connection. And so the more marginalized people, because of histories of drug and alcohol use, were more likely to be white. And so it was sort of a complicated interplay of dimensions of marginalization.
Thank you, Andrea. I think, looking at the time, so I do want to give space for interaction. So we all have microphones, so feel free to ask any of us anything, or to just throw a question at the four of us, and then we can just see who picks it up. So, or responses, it doesn't have to be a question, it can just be your thought or how something resonated with you.
Can I borrow one of them?
So I'll just take the one in the back first, because you are used to yeah, so in the back, and then here in the front. Thanks.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I'm also new to doing research in the Netherlands. I just started my PhD, also looking at issues of urban inequalities and criminalization. I'm from Mexico, so the Dutch context is quite new for me. So recently I've been kind of looking through policy documents, specifically surrounding the election and these kind of debates, trying to understand how Dutch people conceptualize of crime. And what I've seen so far is that, crime is kind of constructed as being anti-Dutch. Like when you do criminal behavior, it's because you're not integrated to the Netherlands, or you're threatening freedom, which is a very, very Dutch value. This kind of effectively colors crime, right? So it kind of pushes crime as this doesn't happen with good white Dutch people, but somewhere else. So I'm wondering also, for the people that studied crime in Amsterdam, how does this kind of play out in your field work? Because I'm kind of coming more from looking at policy documents, specifically surrounding the elections, which tend to be quite, inflammatory and more, all the debates intensify. So how does this play out at an everyday level? And for the people of the US, do you see also something like this happening in the US? Because the migration history is also very different there.
Oh, you hit a spot there, Ricardo. I think especially when we think about regular crime, it tends to be very much externalized. So it tends to be very much about these people being nuisance and causing problems. It tends to be about the margins of the city, about young Dutch Moroccan kids, about Black kids, about drill rap groups, and also these scares, these cycles of moral panics around people of color's youth expressions. It's just a very cyclical, returning thing. Like every electoral cycle comes with its own kind of version of the drill rap scare. Not to downplay that there is violence, of course, in communities of color. But when it comes to understanding organized crime, that's where the discourse shifts a bit. And that's also where I think some of the pushback is coming from people who study organized crime, who are looking more at the facilitation of bigger, much more money-making, bigger types of crime, including money laundering and massive amounts of drug trafficking, drug production in the southern Netherlands, especially the production of synthetic drugs. And the recent focus as a result of that on quote-unquote undermining. So this notion that organized crime, which is in Dutch is the underworld, is undermining our institutions and our economy. So but it does tend to very much keep it as something external. So even though organized crime is understood as something that is perhaps more Dutch, or woven into the Dutch economy, it is still very much externalized as something like, but good Dutch citizens are not criminal, right? So it is very much like, it's very internationalized. You'll always hear them speaking of not just the Dutch mafia, but it's also the Colombian mafia, it's also the Mokoro mafia, it's also the, and then they like to focus more on that, right, than the connection to Dutch businesses, Dutch banks, Dutch, yeah. And there, I mean, I don't want to reproduce there the divide. So also when I say Dutch businesses and Dutch banks, that's, yeah, I think we should be careful also not kind of reproducing in the way we talk about it, this kind of...
Yeah, I don't fully agree with you, because I think even when it's about organized crime, there is this discourse of nostalgia almost about the good old days when organized crime was white and Dutch, and the criminals still had morale, and they had a moral code, and
but this is what
and
I mean,
nowadays
right?
all these Moroccan kids just buy Uzis and shoot everyone, and it's totally changed. Even I think there is this strong tradition also of culturalizing citizenship in the Netherlands. So the good citizens are the white Dutch people, and the bad ones are always foreign. So we have to take away the nationality of criminals, which is a big like... It's coming back every election cycle, indeed. But there is this. I think now also in the debate about organized crime, there is almost this nostalgia about the good old days when our criminals were still our criminals.
So there's not a denial of there having been Dutch organized crime. There's just an or not just, but there is an overemphasis on the other. So. Yeah, I don't know how, but it's not. There's not an entire denial of that whether there is organized crime in. I don't know.
So, I did fieldwork in 2 Boston area communities. One of them was a predominantly Black neighborhood in Boston, and one was a majority white community outside of Boston that had seen, like within the past 20 years or so, a rapid influx of people of color and immigrants. And there were starkly different narratives around crime in those 2 places. And so the US has a very racialized sort of meta-crime narrative of the crime that people tend to talk about the most are violent crime committed by young Black men and gang members. And so this was common across the 2 neighborhoods. In the Black neighborhood, there was a much more nuanced understanding of what that meant and how that translated into incarceration, that they were still concerned about violence, but they recognized that that was not the entire prison population, for example. And so they were, they would sort of constantly remind people that the crime and the criminals and the violence that were actually a concern was a tiny majority of the people who were defined as criminals and incarcerated. And so they cared about violence, they were concerned about violence, but they also knew that you can't just say that equals the prison population, for example. In the neighborhood, in the white sort of dominated neighborhood with increasing numbers of people of color and immigrants, it's exactly what you were talking about. Crime is something that is committed by outsiders against the good community members. And so there was a very racialized and sort of externalizing and othering, like crime is something that others do against the good people of the community. And I think that's exactly why, right? So it was how they sort of related to people of color and what that meant and how they understood that.
I'll just add one thing. In the United States, we have 2 borders. We have a northern border with Canada, and we have a southern border with Mexico. I live on the southern border with Mexico. The southern border is the only one that's militarized. It's the only one. It's the only one where every politician every Republican politician in the nation has to say something about. It's the only one. Nobody says anything about Canada. It's just not a discussion. And the only place where evil people and harmful people and, any kind of negative representation you can associate, the only place those people come from are the southern border. And again, the police, our border agents, are frontline defense. They're soldiers. And so, it's just another way to demonstrate, that there's a kind of ontology to criminality, that criminality is seen as a corporeal, ontological subject, that it's a certain kind of body, right? And it's also a geographic phenomenon. It comes from a certain kind of place, and we have to police those people, right? So whether we're talking about Boston or Chicago or the Netherlands, foreigners, brown people, poor people, queer people in a lot of ways, these are the bodies that have to be policed. And I, there's just a lot of continuity between what's happening here in the Netherlands right now and what's been going on in the United States, really for about 170 years.
Okay, I think we can take the last. Okay, so suddenly there are 3 fingers here. So let's take all 3 of your comments/questions. And then there's one in the back also. We'll take all 4. Just throw it out.
More comment, and it doesn't negate the truth of anything you've been saying. But for the Netherlands, I think you could also think another sort of line of history, which you hinted at a little bit, but which is maybe more similar to Italy's sort of north-south divide, or maybe the UK, also north-south, but in the other direction. Because a lot of the stories also about sexuality and too many children and wrong types of sex and whatnot are also very much projected on Catholics and people coming from the south of the Netherlands to the cities in the west, and not knowing how to live properly in cities. And not being civilized. And I think the great ease with which we say, like, oh yeah, Brabant, like, of course, like organized crime. And there's also popular culture series about this, generally also constructed more as white and Catholic and, not urban. It's also geographical. It's also, a very clear othering. But it's not fully separate, but it is distinct from these more colonial histories of racialization, I think. And it's still at work, I think, in our spatial imaginaries of criminogenic spaces and types of crime. And maybe it also has U.S. residences, like West Virginia, or possibly. But I think it also has its own histories that we could keep in mind. It's mostly a comment.
I realize this might be sort of a very difficult question for the end, but I'm just thinking, because we are very much behind in the Netherlands, I think, on our awareness and even acknowledging institutional racism. Like, I did research on youth crime, and then I went to the US and then I got pointed out by the language I used, and before that no one even pointed anything out to me, and I was just like, okay, this is a problem. So I'm just thinking, what can we sort of take from the US, where they've been aware of this for much longer? For example, here there was a book published called The Mokro Mafia. I think, like, and I spoke to one of the authors, they really regret it now, but I doubt if in like the US there would have even been, I think there would have been much more upheaval about these kind of things. So can you offer us some sort of perspective? What can we learn to break this cycle and to be more aware and actually tackle this issue here?
That's a
question.
Keep your thoughts.
Very other random questions.
Okay. Okay, so while you respond, maybe the mic can go to the back. There was a lady with a...
So one of the things is just make sure you never say we're not as bad as the United States, because that's always a bad thing to say. So just don't say that. But I think really looking at the work of feminists and I think feminist studies and Black studies is a good place to get acquainted with how these concepts, histories, and analytical frameworks work. I would say, you know, like an introductory to Black studies, an introductory to feminist studies is a wonderful way to equip yourself with the conceptual tools you need to pivot to this place, right? And as I was saying to someone earlier, you know, it might require stretching them a little bit to make sure that they fit, because you can't just pick up one concept here and put it here. But that's actually not as hard as one may think. It just means just sort of think it through this context. But I think feminist studies, I would say queer studies as well, and Black studies are a really useful toolkit to develop what you might need to do that kind of work here.
I just want to add two quick things. One is kind of on the idea of stretching concepts or something like that. I think understanding the local context is part of this, and so it's not going to be the same, but some of the dynamics about power and things like that, you know, you sort of understand the local context and who the players are and what the relevant groupings are. It won't look like the U.S. But I would also say, you know, don't give U.S. scholars too much credit, because I think that this is still a very contested, not sort of agreed upon, not everybody takes, you know, critical race theory seriously, for example. So it's still like, you know, the U.S. has plenty of distance to go, both in terms of policy and in terms of research and academics. So it's, you know, people are constantly pushing back, and that's true here too, so I'm sure.
Thank you, guys. So you have the microphone now. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this great event. Very much enjoyed the whole history that you presented very much, but also the shift to Amsterdam and the Netherlands. And my question is actually more about how it is in the Netherlands, and goes to Femke. Because I thought it was very interesting how you made it, I think more as a side comment, but I was really intrigued by that and would like to know more about it, how Amsterdam has this containment policies packaged into social welfare policy and in narratives of care. And you also said something like we might not have mass incarceration, but have a huge children protection industry. And I would like to know a bit more about the historical and temporal dimension, and whether you see there was a huge shift and increase, and which time that happened. And I mean, I guess this is not just racialized, but very much classed. But maybe there are different temporal rhythms of increasing this and this becoming racialized. Because I know, for example, in Germany, with the huge influx of refugees, childcare also became lots of racialized in a way it wasn't before. And I would be interested in these temporal rhythms. And I would also interested in some speculative reasoning about why you have this so much packaged into care paradigms, which I think is similar to how it works in Germany, but is quite different, for example, how it is in France, where they have mass incarceration in a very racialized regime happening temporarily much later than it was in the US, but with not so different patterns nevertheless, right? So I would be interested in whether you can think of any reasons why this is different in the Netherlands. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. I'm not...
Give a lecture on this.
I'll give a really short one. I'm not a historian, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is that actually the major perpetrators of this shift of like containment policies packaged as care are the social democrats in the Netherlands. So when we go back in history to, well, basically the beginning of the 20th century, but also, so I live in the north side of Amsterdam. Up until the 30s, that social democrats actually designed working class neighborhoods where they could place the undesirables, as they were named back at the days. So those were families, mostly unemployed families with many children, who were seen as bad citizens, not behaving according to the normative standards. And they had to be re-educated in order to be uplifted. So there was this very strong discourse of uplifting the people, or like emancipating the people. And therefore they had to be placed in these walled. So in the north, in my neighborhood, there was a walled neighborhood with overseers, women, who were social workers, who were coming into the homes every day to control whether the beds were made, whether the children's hairs were combed. And the kids had to go to school with an armband with a certain color, so everybody could see that they were coming from this specific neighborhood. So during the war, mind you, this neighborhood was used to place Jewish people before they were transported to the camps in Germany, because it was very convenient, right? There was already this neighborhood which was walled off with a tower and at the entrance. So this was a social democratic project to emancipate the working class. So I think this containment policies that are closeted in a care narrative, they come from that tradition. And of course, so we had pillarization, so there were all these, like, there was this very sort of fragmented social care landscape in the Netherlands. But after we shifted into this, participation society, a multicultural society, the social domain and the care system became very much centralized by the government. And then, of course, it became very much focused on migrant populations, populations of color coming into the Netherlands, with that same narrative, right? We have to emancipate these people. In order for them to be emancipated, they have to be heavily controlled. So we have to come into the homes. So this is the big scare that many families of color have. You know, if you don't go to the consultatiebureau, like where you have to go to weigh your baby when it's just being born, if you don't do all the right things, they will take your child away if you don't parent in the right way. So it's a very ingrained system of surveillance into this social domain. And it's the same is done with refugees. So I was just, when you talked about how this, reflects also the handling of the refugee situation. So we have this big refugee camp in the east of the Netherlands, and people were sleeping in tents because there were no beds in the hall in the last winter. And then the municipality said, the tents are not allowed because of a care rationale, because we cannot see what's happening inside of the tents. So who knows? Maybe someone is stabbing someone else with a tent. What's it called in a tent pole? So it's for your own good. You have to sleep in the snow and the pouring rain outside without tents, because we are a caring welfare state, the Dutch state, right? So it's. You see, I find it also, in that way, I totally agree with you. We should never say that we are better than the US. We have this tendency to see ourselves as very progressive, right? We have a very progressive tradition. The Social Democrats were great, we invented the welfare system. But if you see, like, this was a core element of that very welfare system that the Dutch are so proud of, this kind of containment policy. So, sorry, it did become a bit of a long lecture, but
I think we'd be safe to say that one of the key things to keep in mind when we think about the difficulty of reform and abolition in the Dutch context is that the social welfare state masks as this very good and progressive and wonderful state, which
let's say if we do an and, yes, it can be that, maybe, and so, but it is also a surveillance and control system. It's a very ingrained and very all-encompassing way of surveilling and controlling your population and molding them gently, carefully toward what is, well, I would say the white middle class, highly educated ideal and emancipated ideal, right? And that's, yeah. Did you still want to? Sorry. I'm just trying to wrap up because I'm looking at the clock and we're 10 minutes over time. So please take these as the words of as the wrap up, because I want you guys to have time to have drinks and talk with each other. I want to thank all of our speakers, Rashad especially for your excellent keynote talk, Andrea also for being here in your keynote talk in the day, Femke for so graciously joining us on stage and offering also your insights. I'd also like to thank my team members at the project for the Amsterdam, the Principle of Inequality project, Fleur and Thijs, Elise and Jana, and Jolan, I think we can pile him in. And all of you for being here, especially those of you who are also here throughout the day since 8:30 in the morning. It has been a long day. You deserve wine and beer, so please.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Julien.